The worst case scenario that many people are speculating would be an open conflict, a hot war between the United States and China. Most likely it would involve Taiwan. That would be probably the entry point. And I want to be very clear on this. That would be an absolute disaster for the entire population of the world. Every country would be affected by that. You have the two largest superpowers, the two largest militaries going head to head. It would not end pretty. I mean, you don't have a decisive winner. I don't think you could say the United States would clearly win this or China would clearly win this. You have two heavyweight fighters that are prepared to go, 10 rounds. And at the end of it, you're going to have two bloody, beat up fighters that have just annihilated each other. But most importantly, I mean, that would absolutely send the entire world economy into devastation. I mean, we're talking global panic, global recession, and it would really erase a lot of the economic progress that we've seen around the world. But the key thing here is that, our economies are so interconnected. Like I said, China, the number one trading partner for 120 countries around the world. That is not a small number. There's many countries that critically rely on China, and same with the United States. I mean, we're not immune from that either. And I think what that would be the worst case scenario. And my hope is, and what I'm seeing is similar to this Nancy Pelosi thing, is that cooler heads will prevail. I do believe in my heart of hearts that the United States government and the Chinese government, both of them, do not want to go to a hot war. They're not stupid. They know that would devastate each other's economy. It would devastate the world economy. It would be catastrophic, is the word that would be used to describe that. It would be absolutely catastrophic. So I think, what we're looking at and what we're certainly going into right now is certainly a Cold War. It's very much a Cold War mentality. We're seeing the United States actively trying to decouple and de-risk from China. We're seeing, industries being shifted. But there's a lot of interesting things going on because of how interconnected it is.
In this episode of the WTFinance podcast, I have the pleasure of welcoming on Cyrus Jansen, who's an international speaker, business consultant, content creator, and China insider. So, Cyrus, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Anthony, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No problem. And I'm really looking forward to conversation because it's if we talk about China-US relations, it's definitely something that's I feel like every year it's just getting a hotter topic. It's more is being talked about. But I was thinking maybe we could start this conversation if we go back in time and look at maybe where China-US relationship was at the start of the 21st century. Just from an outsider's perspective, it seems as if the relationship was becoming more positive at that period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd like to actually go back a little bit further. Let's go back to the beginning of the U.S.-China relationship. So, 1972, Richard Nixon goes over, he formally establishes this relationship between the United States and China. And that was a really pivotal thing because up until that point, China was essentially kind of cut off from the world, and it really needed the United States and many foreign countries around the world to pour foreign direct investment into China to really help, build this economy. I mean, back in the 1970s, China was one of the top 10 poorest countries in the world, and it absolutely needed countries like the United States and certainly, countries in Europe and many countries around the world to invest in China, bring in the foreign direct investment, start producing products there and then shipping those over. And that's really, really started China's economic boom. So I actually think, the United States actually had a very large role in that as far as, helping lift millions of, Chinese people out of poverty, certainly as China's economy grew. But just right before we started the 21st century, Bill Clinton, former President Bill Clinton, was really the main driver behind China being admitted into the World Trade Organization. Now, that happened in 1999, and that was a very important time because, we wanted to get China into the World Trade Organization. It certainly benefited China and the world to have them in there. It opened up even more opportunities for them to be doing international business. But there was an interesting thing that the United States made a strategic error and admitting them as well. Because one of the things that they thought is if we invite China into the World Trade Organization, our hope and our assumption is that one day China will actually switch and become a liberal democracy. And this is something the United States does a lot, is that we make assumptions, or we assume that, hey, we assume you're going to be like us, or we assume that you're going to change to be like us. And it very much was an assumption. There was nothing given by China saying, hey, we're going to join, and within 10 to 20 years, we're going to move towards this. China was not interested in changing its government. It was very much interested in continuing to do trade with the world, hence joining the World Trade Organization. But this really was, kind of the first fundamental mistake that actually down the road has led to some bigger conflicts. And of course, we know this is the fact that, the United States does not like the fact that China is a one-party state, that it is on paper, a communist country. Of course, as we know, it is more of a socialist country. It operates as socialist with Chinese characteristics. But, we did have some amazing things. There's two events I really want to point out. One was in 2008, was the Beijing Olympics. And this was an amazing time. I was in China at that time, and this was an incredible coming out party for China. This, 2008 Beijing Olympics really was China's announcing to the world, like, hey, we are here. We are booming. Our economy is booming. We're going to be a major player in this game. And I never forget the images of President George Bush sitting in the stands amongst the Chinese fans, waving his American flag, the Chinese fans waving their Chinese flags, and, the president there watching Michael Phelps win a record 8 gold medals. But it was amazing because you saw the president amongst all these Chinese people and amongst, just enjoying the Olympic Games. And you kind of think about that now, it would be almost impossible to imagine the US president going there and doing that in China. But also another interesting event was 2011, when at the time, Xi Jinping and Joe Biden were both the respective vice presidents of China and the United States. And at the time, they both met and they went to this classroom in Beijing. And you can look it up on YouTube. There's a video about this showing, Joe Biden addressing this classroom of Chinese students in Beijing and said, the United States does not fear a rising China. In fact, we want to see a rising China, because if your economy continues to grow, guess what? You're going to buy more American products. It means more profit for Americans. It's a win-win situation. So it's quite interesting to see Joe Biden as Vice President Joe Biden and Xi Jinping as Vice President Xi Jinping back in 2011, where it was a much happier time. And there was very much this idea of, US and China working together. And Biden has now since very much changed that. He has come out in recent months and said, I will not allow China to continue to grow. We will contain them. We will stop this growth, not under my watch, were his exact words. And so a very big fundamental shift that we've seen kind of in this very interesting, time frame of US-China relations. But, it's been a very interesting 50 years, but it is an important relationship we'll continue discussing.
Yeah, and I know, I guess a lot happened between that meeting and where we are today. And I think a lot of people put it onto the, Trump maybe, and the sort of increasing rhetoric and maybe increasing hawkishness against China. But right. I know during sort of early 2010s, there was a bit of conflict as well, just to do with sort of IP and other factors as well. I'm not sure if you can go more into that and then maybe get on to where it really escalated to the point maybe the catalyst.
I think one of the things that we often hear about is, intellectual property theft from China. And the interesting thing with this is actually how China's domestic competition is very different from the United States. This is actually a very interesting insight into how China works. A lot of people don't realize this, but imitation or copying is actually the main driver behind innovation in China. Okay, it sounds a bit interesting, but sounds a bit, weird, or completely wrong. But, in the United States, for example, in Silicon Valley, you're very much protected, right? Copying is very much frowned upon. And there are strict IP laws that forbid that. But in China, it's a way that what happens is, for example, if you and I both have an e-commerce company and we're copying you, you're copying us, you basically have to create the most robust business models that are kind of industry proven. And it's a very hard, cutthroat business inside of China. The interesting thing is that, for example, we think of Alibaba, right? Alibaba is a household name now. Most everybody around the world knows Alibaba. Well, it's one of tens of thousands of e-commerce brands in China. We only know about Alibaba. There's over 10,000 others that, that are still operating and still fighting. And it's only because Alibaba has proven their method that they've gone to the top. The interesting thing I want to talk about specifically, though, is when we look at the World Trade Organization, there are many violations that China has done. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, the United States has actually more violations than China, and actually has a tremendous amount of violations, for example, with Europe. So we have a lot of, the United States actually breaking laws and actually breaking policies with the World Trade Organization against our partners in Europe. And it is kind of one of those things that we all need to be better at. I'm certainly not saying, hey, what China's doing is right, nor should we give them the pass, but it is something that just happens in the industry around the world. And the fact that the United States is not immune from this either, is mainly my main point. So we're seeing both the United States and China and other countries. That's why the World Trade Organization exists, and that's why these policies are there. But it is very common for countries to go farther and actually break these laws sometimes.
Yeah, I think maybe the issue is more with the World Trade Organization, the fact that no one's going to listen to their punishments, or no one's really going to listen to what they say. As you said, everyone's going to break the rules if it benefits their own country.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the interesting thing is we also see a lot of U.S. tech companies actually are copying, Chinese ones as well. I mean, I'll give you a couple of examples. Is when you look at Airbnb. Airbnb, when it first started out, it was a company that just was like a hotel. You could book for example, a 2-night stay in London. Okay, I can book that on Airbnb. Then they launched this thing called experiences. So, for example, if you wanted to come to London and you wanted to, be there, you could book an Airbnb, but you could also have a guided tour of some of the famous sites there. Well, that idea was actually copied from a Chinese tech company that, Ctrip, for example, they had pioneered that kind of experience journey. I mean, even a better one would be, how social media, Instagram, everything has shifted to short form video content. All of that came from TikTok, right? All of that came from Douyin, which is the Chinese domestic version of TikTok. But that is a very much that, we've seen every social media company pivot their strategies in a technology and really a format that was pioneered by China, and TikTok being very much ahead of the game.
Yeah, and I understand your point, but I guess maybe if we go to more physical products and I guess innovations in sort of new products, and I guess there's maybe more for the US and even potentially China for those companies who do create that. They put all that time, all that R&D into it. They file a patent, and then if another country were to go and copy that, I know it's sort of it's better for the consumer, but maybe for that company it sort of doesn't encourage them to innovate. Is that something that you think is potentially an issue?
Well, I think it definitely could be an issue, but I think it goes back to that where, I mean, again, I want to have these World Trade Organizations, they exist for a reason, and there is, we have these protocols in place, and it is on everybody. So again, we need to hold China accountable. We need to hold the United States accountable. We need to hold everybody, but it does happen, and so there are certain cases where, certainly these things go to court, or we, have a ruling like that. I think it's a good thing, and they exist for a reason, and it's absolutely, part of that both countries really should be, working on improving.
Yeah, I agree. So when did the relationship start to deteriorate?
Well, I think, Anthony, I want to go back to kind of around the millennial. So what we're seeing is that around 2000, at the time, the United States still had a very large market share of being the number one trading partner in the world, right? So you go back to 2000, and around the world, most countries can count the United States as their top trading partner. Now, fast forward to 2020, and you see a very big fundamental shift. Okay, we've seen the Chinese economy essentially triple in that amount of time, and we've also seen the fact that now the vast majority of the world now counts China as the number one trading partner. So you see China's influence was growing larger and larger. To date right now, I mean, as of 2023, there's over 120 countries around the world that now count China as their number one trading partner. So this is a huge number. And I think what we're seeing is we're seeing a lot of, we're seeing a lot of countries, or we're seeing the United States basically look at China saying, wow, they're really growing much bigger. The economy is getting bigger. They're getting more and more influence. And there was a big thing in America where China is going to overtake the United States. China is going to become the number one economy in the world. And for example, for the United States, we have a very much, we love hegemony, right? We love being number one. And I think what's the problem is that we kind of mistranslate as, if China has the number one economy in the world, it doesn't mean that China wants to rule the world, nor will they be the number one superpower in the world. Actually, when we actually look at GDP per citizen, the United States still has a much higher rate, almost 5 times higher than China. So even though, the GDP is very large in China, person to person, it actually, the United States is still a much more wealthier country. In addition to that, we know from just a simple thing, for example, English is the world's most spoken and used language. It is, for many culturally, many countries around the world follow the United States. I mean, even if we look at, for example, Hollywood, our Hollywood pictures kind of dominate around the world, and they're even popular in China, for example. So I think kind of culturally, this is what I always say, is that it's not China's ambition to, overtake the United States. They're just kind of getting their seat at the table. Naturally, a country with 1.4 billion people and being the #1 trading partner for 120 countries around the world, of course, it's going to have a huge global influence. And of course, it's going to want to have its say in things. But I never have seen China saying, we want to replace the United States. The United States should be #2. We should be ruling and controlling the world. That's never been China's goal. It's never been their stated goal to do that. And I don't even think it's a big goal for China to overtake the United States in economic terms. China is always trying to improve itself and to try to improve the lives of its citizens. Like I said, 1970, China was one of the, poorest countries in the world. And then you fast forward and it's now the second largest economy. It's lifted over 800 million people out of poverty. There are some amazing things that the Chinese government has done. I mean, and that's not me saying, hey, China's government's perfect or China's government's the best. I'm just recognizing facts. There's undeniable facts that China went from being poor to creating a lot more wealth. It's helped hundreds of millions of people along the way. And it is important to realize that, as it continues to grow, that it will have a seat at the table, and it's going to want to have its say in global affairs. And that's why, for example, you look at China, I mean, it's a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, right? It's permanent. It can't change. China will be there along with the United States. Both of them will have their say at that Security Council indefinitely because of the status of those countries.
Yeah, but I guess isn't Russia a permanent member as well? So it's
they are. Russia
yeah.
is as well. I mean, it's just, but that's as it should be. I mean, we're all part of this global economy, and I mean, it's the interesting thing, much more China than Russia. I mean, is obviously just how interconnected we are in our global economy, and I think that's something I'll maybe talk on a little bit later, is just how interconnected we are. But I think what we also saw, to kind of get back to the main root of that, is we've seen your question was really what's the main catalyst, is we definitely saw under President Donald Trump this launch of a trade war, which was certainly a catalyst as well. Because the interesting thing is that up until 2017, when you asked Americans, who is the most dangerous country in the world to America, or who is the United States' biggest enemy, China was not even in the top 10, okay, up until 2017. And as a result of, launching the trade war and seeing our media in the United States becoming more and more anti-China, that has skyrocketed. Now, the vast majority of Americans think that China by far is the #1 enemy or the biggest threat to the future of the United States. And so we've seen a fundamental shift in, and also how the media works and how people's perception is easily changed in just a few short years. I mean, we're talking 6 years. It's gone from not being in the top 10 to now clearly being an overwhelming #1. And that's a very big fundamental change that immediately started in 2017.
Okay, so it began then, and then I guess it's sort of been something that's continued to deteriorate. And you mentioned the US, and I guess the US population sort of feel that, but I know I've heard you talk about it as well, how maybe that's similar in China, where you sort of, I guess, at all these periods, you get the hawkish, individuals in the media, in the military, in government, and all these other factors, they come to the forefront. And especially if it's something that citizens start to be concerned about, then they're probably going to get more media time. Is that something that's, I guess, it's probably seen in both countries?
It would be seen in both countries. I want to be very fair and very clear on that. I mean, there has been much more of a anti-American sentiment growing in China as well. And that's why it was very interesting. I had about a 4-year hiatus since my last visit. So last time I visited was 2019. I did have the chance to go back in June 2023 this year. And I was very interested to see, in basically 4 years' time, what was the perception? How was me as an American walking the streets of Shanghai? How would I be perceived? speaking with local Chinese, what is their perceptions of America? I was pleasantly surprised. Most Chinese were still very open to Americans, very welcoming. I had nothing but good experiences this return trip to China. But you do see the people. I'll give you a great example. When Nancy Pelosi flew to Taiwan, you had on Chinese social media a lot of people outraged at China's government saying, I can't believe we didn't take more action. We should have shot down Nancy Pelosi's plane. We should have shown the United States a lesson, teach those Americans, that is very toxic thinking. That would obviously, that would be a disaster, right? If China were to do that. And of course, we see the cooler heads are prevailing inside the China's government. I mean, China's government's not stupid. You can't take down a plane with Nancy Pelosi on board, with the Speaker of the House. I mean, that would be an absolute disaster. It'd be an act of war. And, China would not do that. But again, you see this sentiment online, amongst the Chinese community that wanted the government to be more proactive. We wanted them to do that, but so the Chinese government got a lot of flack online, saying, hey, you're too weak. You need to be stronger against the Americans. But I think China is too smart for that. Obviously, Xi Jinping's not going to make an error like that. I mean, that would just be suicidal. And it'd be a declaration of war, which China does not have an intention to do. So, again, it is going both ways. We need to be very objective and very clear and very fair on how we're analyzing this relationship.
Yeah, and do you think maybe that decreasing, I guess, relationship, increasing aggressive rhetoric has maybe been due to COVID as well? So there's obviously blame going to China, but at the same time, potentially the isolation between the countries.
Yeah, I think, definitely. I mean, that's a huge factor in it. I mean, COVID was a very difficult time for everybody. I mean, the problem is that, we're looking to China to basically blame somebody on. I think, the reality is we live in a planet of 7 billion people. Viruses happen. I think, we've had the health organization, what is it? The national, is it the NHO, the National Health Organization? I mean, has sent scientists to China. They have done a tremendous amount of research. I mean, for example, we hear this theory mainly from the hardcore Republicans that are really preaching this theory that China released it in a laboratory. If you go down the very far rabbit hole on this, you'll actually hear some of these very hawkish Republican voices that actually have come to the conclusion that, hey, the COVID virus is actually not that susceptible to Asians, but it's very susceptible to Caucasians. So China specifically made this virus to attack the Caucasian race, which is just ridiculous. It's absolutely nonsense. There's no facts behind that. It's just nonsense, to be honest, and it's a complete waste of time. But I think you Anthony, you brought up a really big point, was the fact that when China was closed for so long, that's why I had a 4-year gap in my visits to China, is because it was very difficult and it was cut off from the world. And that puts China in a very weak position, because historically, when you look back at China's weakest times, it's when it was cut off from the world. And that's the problem. China was essentially became this place that no one could travel to. And, we couldn't have Americans going there and having there was no tourism going on. There was no business visits going on. I mean, there was foreigners every day were leaving China because they couldn't travel. They wanted to get back home to see their families. And so, we've seen that's a loss. We've seen a tremendous amount of foreigners, expats. We've seen expats leave the big cities, Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen. We've seen, China has lost a very large portion of its expatriate community, and that's not a good thing. China needs expats. They need foreign direct investment. They need to have foreigners on the ground. It is, on one side, it's good if you are a foreigner there, because, there's less of you around. So you have more opportunities. But on a whole, I don't think it's the best for China, and it was very difficult for them being cut off to the world, because it became this mysterious place that no one really knew about. And so that was an unfortunate thing. Thankfully, the borders are open. China has moved away from its zero COVID policy, but we have not seen the flights between the United States and China, for example, are operating at about 10% capacity of what they were in 2019. So we have not seen a huge rebound yet. Interesting enough, the flights are full. I mean, every flight that is going over there is full. I think there is demand, but we're just not seeing that high level. And to be honest, I don't know if we will again. I think it'd be very unlikely, I think, for China to attract a similar level of expats that it once did back in the heyday. And I don't think, I think those days are gone, quite frankly.
Yeah, and you mentioned a few cities there. I guess even though it's not mainland China, I imagine that Hong Kong has probably suffered a lot as well from a reduction of their expat population.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it definitely has, and I think it's just a interesting shift in times, that we're seeing there. I mean, there's still, I have a lot of friends in Hong Kong. I mean, they went through their struggles as well, and it's certainly rebounded. I mean, there's a little bit more optimism, I think, in Hong Kong. I mean, even they're starting to get some mainland tourists back, to crossing the border from mainland China into Hong Kong for tourism. That, of course, was a very big driver of the Hong Kong economy, was mainland tourism. So I mean, entire sectors of tourism, hotels, restaurants, shopping, got hammered with China being closed down. I mean, it was a very tough loss for Hong Kong as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. So, as we've mentioned, sort of the aggression has continued, or the relationship has continued to worsen. I guess conflict has continued to accelerate. If it continues on the current trajectory, where do you see, I guess, US-China relationships going?
Well, Anthony, I want to take it. Let's go to the extreme. What's the worst case scenario here? The worst case scenario that many people are speculating would be an open conflict. A hot war between the United States and China. Most likely, it would involve Taiwan. That would be probably the entry point. And I want to be very clear on this. That would be an absolute disaster for the entire population of the world. Every country would be affected by that. You have the two largest superpowers, the two largest militaries going head to head. It would not be end pretty. I mean, you don't have a decisive winner. I don't think you could say the United States would clearly win this or China would clearly win this. You have two heavyweight fighters that are prepared to go, 10 rounds. And at the end of it, you're going to have two bloody, beat up fighters that have just annihilated each other. But most importantly, I mean, that would absolutely send the entire world economy into devastation. I mean, we're talking global panic, global recession, and it would really erase a lot of the economic progress that we've seen around the world. But the key thing here is that, our economies are so interconnected. Like I said, China, world, the number one trading partner for 120 countries around the world. That is not a small number. There's many countries that critically rely on China, and same with the United States. I mean, we're not immune from that either. And I think what that would be the worst case scenario. And my hope is, and what I'm seeing is similar to this Nancy Pelosi thing, is that cooler heads will prevail. I do believe in my heart of hearts that the United States government and the Chinese government, both of them, do not want to go to a hot war. They're not stupid. They know that would devastate each other's economy. It would devastate the world economy. It would be catastrophic, is the word that would be used to describe that. It would be absolutely catastrophic. So I think, what we're looking at and what we're certainly going into right now is certainly a Cold War. It's very much a Cold War mentality. We're seeing the United States actively trying to decouple and de-risk from China. We're seeing, industries being shifted. But there's a lot of interesting things going on because of how interconnected it is. For example, the best experts that really know global trade and are specifically talking about US-China, we can decouple from China, but that basically kind of results to around about a 15% reduction in US-China trade. I mean, we really can't go below that threshold because, we would start basically affecting our own economy. And that would be, also very devastating for Americans as well. So, I mean, it is something where, one of the things that I have always said on my YouTube channel is that when the United States and China work together, the world wins. And it is important that we don't lose that focus nor that hope. I think a lot of people have lost hope in that. A lot of people have thought this relationship's done. I mean, it's never going to improve. It's only going to get worse and worse and worse. And no matter how dark and gloomy that relationship could look, it's important to never, lose faith that, hopefully these two countries can find a way to exist and, find this balance that we need in the world, and realize that the United States and China are both not going anywhere. They're going to be here. And so, peaceful coexistence is something that should be a priority for everybody.
Yeah, I agree. That would be the best way forward. You're being very positive, and I'm probably being the the downer of the conversation. But I think
That's fine. Yeah.
asking a lot of questions that probably a lot of our viewers and other people have as well. So we've talked about how the US is decoupling, but it does also look that China is sort of potentially decoupling. They're sort of hedging their bets. This interview is going up in a few days, but today is the 24th of August, and I think there was the BRICS meeting, and they're talking about sort of expanding that organization. So it does really look like there's a bifurcation within the world, and it's not just the US that's, I guess, encouraging it. It's also coming from a China perspective as well. So I think,
Yeah.
is that something that you're seeing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think I've covered BRICS extensively on my YouTube channel. I think what's interesting is we're looking at there's a lot of the global south that has essentially been ignored from a long time, from the United States. And this has been a very strategic move from China over the past decade. For example, 10 years ago, China launched the Belt and Road Initiative. They basically targeted these countries in the global south because largely their needs have not been met from the United States. Best example would be Africa. 54 countries in Africa, 50 of them have joined the Belt and Road Initiative. And a lot of them have very positive marks and reviews about China, basically working with China on this. And let's be clear, there have been many projects that have gone over budget that has caused a huge debt, things like that. It hasn't been this perfect relationship, but at the end of the day, it's an interesting one where for example, the United States is not pouring in that investment. And for example, if you're a poor African country, what do you need? You need infrastructure, right? If you can build us a road, if you can build us an airport, if you can build us a port, you're providing a pathway for us to improve our economy and eventually get there. Eventually be able to hopefully have a better life in the future by making that investment. And I think what we're seeing is that for example, Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia has been a strategic ally of the United States for well over 50 years. Okay. I mean, in fact, it's probably been the best deal in the history of the world is how the United States brokered that deal to sell Saudi oil, in US dollars. And that has been a backbone of how this country, the United States, has functioned. Saudi Arabia has been a key strategic ally. It's very interesting. We have a very direct policy with Saudi Arabia. Essentially, we will give you protection militarily. We will ignore any of your human right abuses. We could care less about that. As long as you sell that oil in dollar, then you are good to go. And that's exactly how that works. That relationship works. And this is an interesting thing where, for example, my former career as a golf professional. I mean, we've actually seen an interesting thing where, Saudi Arabia has sponsored this entire new golf league, and Americans are like, we can't be doing business with Saudi Arabia. Like they don't have a democracy. And it's like, hey guys, you do realize our entire United States economy is based on Saudi oil, right? I mean, do you drive a car? Well, then you're helping support Saudi Arabia. That's just how it works. That is exactly how the United States economy functions. But yet we're seeing that shift where Saudi Arabia is one of the 6 new potential countries to join this bloc. And I think for Saudi Arabia, they realize that, hey, we don't need to be exclusive to the United States. We would definitely want to, hedge our bets as well. I mean, we have a lot of oil. China wants to do that. That's great. Interesting one was Qatar. Qatar signed a 27-year LNG gas deal with China. That was right at when Qatar was hosting the World Cup. It was a massive deal. Many European countries were very cautious. Should we go in this deal? 27 years, long deal. China said, "Hey, we'll lock in. Hey, let's lock that deal in. Let's guarantee us to get that gas, that natural gas, or that I think it's liquid nitrogen gas, LNG. Let's lock that in and be able to guarantee that we can have this energy source." And we're seeing that with everything. I mean, this is the key thing. For example, when we look at rare earth minerals. China controls 90% of rare earth mineral production in the world. The United States need rare earth minerals, right? We need that to manufacture the weapons that our U.S. military needs. So, there's key industries. For example, lithium is a very big industry, for example, that China controls a huge portion of that. We look at, one of the lithium mines that is very, very active and is a big one who's down in Chile. Well, Chile has now nationalized that, which means that if you want to get lithium from Chile, you're now going to be working with the Chilean government because they realize how strategic it is to hold that. And so we're seeing a lot of these. We see Brazil's president had said, every day I dream about making transactions outside of the United States dollar. This is a interesting thing where a lot of these countries in the global south have seen the economic sanctions against Russia and have seen the United States moving and saying, hey, instead of doing 100% of our trade in US dollar, why don't we start to why don't we start to have a little bit more options, kind of like a stock portfolio, right? You're not going to buy one stock, right? You're going to have a multitude of stocks and have diversification. And I think you're seeing a very similar thing where, for example, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, they're saying, hey, we could all do trade amongst us with our own local currencies. I think that's a big thing. BRICS is, certainly there's speculation that they could create a new currency. There's speculation that it could potentially be backed by gold. I think more realistically, it is, saying we can do transactions in our local currencies. I think that's of a more realistic goal for BRICS. And just having, but we look at, for example, the G7 versus BRICS, very clear. The economies of the BRICS nations are much bigger than the G7 combined. So it is a very powerful alliance as well, and it will have its seat, at this table as well, as I like to say.
Yeah, I guess the challenge there is that someone has to have that deficit where they're, purchasing more from the external countries, and they're, I guess, and they're selling. Do you see China able to potentially shift to that consumption economy, or is that maybe going to be a bit of a stretch?
It's going to be a tough challenge for China to shift to a consumption economy, because it's an interesting one. We're seeing right now in China, there are a tremendous amount of financial setbacks, right? We do see, the manufacturing output is declining. We see youth unemployment is rising. GDP is detracting, contracting. There are a lot of economic factors that are not as well, but it's an interesting one where, in the United States, for example, we are a consumption economy, and we have, for example, credit card debt in the United States just released a couple of weeks ago, was now over $1 trillion. And you see, we live in this consumption state, but it is much easier when you're a country that has the foreign reserve currency, right? You have the US dollar, which is a very strong currency. It is the most widely used currency. It's this currency reserve. And it is also a very different model, because that's what people are saying in China. Chinese people need to spend more money, right? They need to consume more products. They need to spend more. And there was even inside China's government, there was an idea. Hey, maybe the Chinese government should give 1,000 renminbi to every Chinese citizen to encourage them to go spending. Well, 1,000 renminbi is approximately $130, $140. It's not really a lot of money, and it's not like, is that going to be that? Like, how much would that cost, right? Times 1.4 billion people, there'd be a tremendous cost for that. Would it be this huge, if everyone gets $140, is it going to be, automatically it's going to solve the economic problems in China? Of course not. The interesting thing is that what we're seeing in China right now is actually, and this kind of goes back down to the Chinese culture, the 3 years of COVID was a very difficult time for Chinese people. It was, especially, for example, in 2022 in Shanghai, they had a brutal 100-day lockdown in Shanghai that, in my opinion, was very much overkill. China should have opened by then. It was not necessary. It was way over the top. And, realizing that, hey, there's just no way to control this indefinitely. Like, at some point, you're going to have to open up and just kind of take it, like we all have, right? Like, no country is immune. A lot of props to China. They did an amazing job in 2020, 2021, when it was the original variant. But, once COVID became to the point where it was as common as the common cold, as far as transferring it, there's no way to contain that. It's impossible. So, that you saw China overnight. All right, we're going to just open it up, let it rip. And, we're going to, they did very good to prolong that. But I think for the Chinese people, what they're saying is like, man, we've had a long 3 years. We need to lay low. Let's not spend a lot of money. Let's not go extravagant. Let's kind of lay low. Let's save our money. Let's just kind of, and that's kind of been a very unexpected thing that a lot of people, they thought, hey, they're going to have this revenge tourism. All these Chinese people are going to start traveling around the world, spending all this money. We've seen kind of the opposite, which I think has actually surprised many people, because they're like, wow, you know what? We don't need to do that right now. Let's lay low. Let's be a little bit more cautious. Chinese as a culture tends to save more money, generally speaking. We in the West, most specifically in the United States, we tend to live on debt for most people in the side of this country. Chinese is very, debt averse. They don't want to be going into personal debt. So yeah, that's a little bit on that. So, I think what many people, I think a lot of very pro-China people would say, hey, look, the dollar's doomed. The dollar's done. China's going to, totally de-dollarize. China has $3 trillion of dollars. They have trillion US dollars that they hold right now. I mean, it's not, again, I think it's more about diversification. Interesting enough, France, they had done a transaction, I think, and I think it was a deal where they had bought some gas from China and they conducted that in renminbi. So that's just more what's going to be happening. And again, I think it is something that we've seen around the world. Example, countries in South America saying, hey, why don't we just trade in our local currencies? I think we're just kind of shifting to this multipolar world. That's what's going on right now.
Yeah, and I guess you could say competition isn't a bad thing. So if we go to maybe if you look at your perfect scenario of US China relations, what would that be? And I guess what do you think both leaders and I guess both populations will have to do to get to that point?
I think what has to happen is there needs to be more dialogue and there needs to be more communication. In my opinion, I think that President Biden and President Xi should be having a monthly phone call. I mean, we make such a huge deal when they have a phone call, and I believe, I could be wrong on this, but I believe they've only had one phone call by the time since Biden has been president. I know they did meet, for example, person to person last November in Bali, Indonesia at the G20. But I mean, there needs to be more communication. That is a good thing. And that's the tough thing that's saying right now in America is, for example, if our politicians are going to China and meeting, a lot of people are, very hawkish against that. We shouldn't be meeting with China. We shouldn't be talking to them. We absolutely should be, and I think it goes both ways. Like I'd love to see Xi Jinping come to the United States. I'd love to see him, sit down and actually give an interview on 60 Minutes or CNN. I mean, one of these major publications. I think it was Jiang Zemin, former Chinese president, who did that. Who came to the United States and sat down for a formal interview. And I think that kind of reduces that barrier to entry a little bit. It's a little bit more personable. For example, Xi Jinping, I mean, he, as a young man, came to Iowa, in the farmlands of Iowa. He spent a lot of time there. I think, maybe I think 8 or 10 days, looking at all of these farmland in the United States. And, there's a small town in Iowa that has this close connection to, Xi Jinping. I think it would be great for him to go back there. I think things like this to foster a better relationship. Anything with communication, I think, is big. Like I said, I'd like to see them communicating more. But I think with this is we have to realize from a United States perspective is that, kind of going back to how I opened this conversation up. In 1999, we made the assumption that China would become a liberal democracy. And I want to be very clear here. This is my personal belief. The world is too unique and too diverse for only one form of government to exist. Now, by me saying that does not mean that I'm anti-democracy, nor does it mean that I'm pro-communist. It just simply means it's simply me recognizing, as a global citizen that's been traveling the world for 20 plus years, has traveled to over 60 countries, has lived abroad for 15 of those years. I've seen very different systems around the world. I mean, I lived in Canada for 5 years, and Canada's democracy is fundamentally different than the United States. Yes, they're democracies, but they operate completely differently. And I think every country needs to figure that out. When we look at Charlie Munger, who is the right-hand man of Warren Buffett, he very clearly said, when China needed to be a one-party state to make this economic transformation, there's no way it would have happened if they were a liberal democracy, because there's too much argument and there's not this solid movement going forward. When you're at the bottom, you need swift decision-making to get to the top. I mean, the best example of this would be Singapore. I mean, you look at Lee Kuan Yew, who, in my opinion, by far best politician in the history of the world. I'm a huge Lee Kuan Yew fan, and I think what he has done for that country of Singapore is no short of remarkable. But Singapore's democracy is very far from that. It's a one-party state. It has been for over 50 years a one-party state. There's very much restrictions that happen. There's a lot of restrictions that happen there, but it is a very unique form of government that has been wildly successful. And I think, in my opinion, kind of Singapore is this perfect merger of kind of a U.S. and China system. It's the kind of the best of both worlds, in my opinion. And the thing is that China is never going to listen to the United States. China is never going to think, you know what, United States, you're probably right. Why don't we just go ahead and switch our entire democracy, or why don't we switch our entire, system to a democracy? The interesting thing is, if we actually do some research, there was a Harvard study, 13-year Harvard study that was published a few years ago that said over 90% of Chinese citizens actually support and approve of their government. And, I like to reference that because number one, it's Harvard University, one of the most established universities in the entire planet. Number two, it's a very long study, right? It's not a 13-week study, a 13-month study. It's a 13-year study. So, I mean, to get to that level where you have Harvard University doing that amount of research over that amount of time, there's a lot of credibility in there. And there is, it's not me singing praises for China's government. Don't get me wrong. I'm not here to say China's government is great or anything. I have no relationship with China's government. I'm not a Chinese citizen, nor do I live in China. But I'm just observing it. And I'm also observing how people have said, I've gone to very rural villages and I've seen, we have this idea in the West that Xi Jinping is one man. He controls everything. And, it is this dictatorship. China is actually very similar to the United States in this regard, that the local mayors have a very, very pivotal role, and it's much more regionalized than we believe. And it's very similar to the United States. In the United States, and this is why you saw, for example, when you look at my home state of Florida, we have a governor who said, hey, look, with all of these COVID restrictions, we're not doing it. I don't care what Joe Biden in Washington, D.C. says. We're not wearing masks in Florida because this is what we do in Florida. It's the governor who's making that policy and those decisions in that local state. And meanwhile, in California, you have the opposite. Okay, everyone needs to get vaccinated. Everyone needs to wear masks because that's what the local governor wanted to do. And so you have a very similar, thing happening in China, where there is a lot of autonomy given to the local mayors. There's a lot of things happening at the local level that are improving and that are getting better. And that's something we don't see. Beijing does not control every single thing that is happening. It's not Xi Jinping overlooking everything. I mean, he can't. How can he control a country like China? Of course, it's much more complex than that. And that's where the nuance of understanding China really becomes very important. Because quite frankly, we look at China in a very distorted way. And we just look at it as, we look at China, for the vast majority of Americans, they look at China as if it were North Korea. That's how they look at China. And it's much more nuanced. It's much more complex. And again, I'm not here to sing China's praises. I'm not trying to say that China's government is some superior form of government, but it is very interesting to live there, to work there, to see how it functions, and to see how people, generally speaking, have a much higher level of trust in their government. And I'll be honest, I'm an American. I do not know a single person in this country personally that would come out and say, you know what, I trust the United States government. I believe the US government works in my best interest, right? We kind of have this interesting paradox because, we slam China's government for being a one-party state, but at the same standpoint, come ask your average American, do you believe in the US government? Do you trust them? Of course I don't trust them. I don't want less government. We want less government. We want less. And, we look at our electoral process, right? We have, a system where we have, where, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, okay, I've got a choice I have the freedom to choose, but these are two really bad choices here. I don't like either of them. So, there's a lot more nuance. And Anthony, that's the main thing I want people to understand, is that unless you've been to China, you've experienced it, you've really spent time on the ground, you've actually talked to Chinese people and seen how that country functions, it's very hard to get a grasp of what it really is. And you most certainly can't do it by just listening to Western media.
Great point. So, Cyrus, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. My last question is that the message you want people to take away from our conversation? Is there another message that you'd like people to take away from what we talked about?
Well, there's an interesting article that was written on the Washington Post, and this will be my final message here. It's called "A Deep Crisis in China Would Pose a Choice for Two Leading Powers." Now, this is written by Henry Paulson. He's the former Treasury Secretary, former chief executive of Goldman Sachs, so someone that really understands economics, finance. And this is the thing I'm seeing right now, is a lot of people are almost, when China is having these economic challenges, it's almost like, yes, I want China to fail. I want China to go down. I want China to crumble, and we see this kind of celebration. And I think Henry Paulson wrote a really good article here, because he says, those who would celebrate China's daunting challenges should consider the emerging risks that come with that and be careful what you wish for. China's economy, of course, is deeply intertwined with the world economy. It's the top trading partner to more than 120 countries and the largest driver of global gross domestic product growth. It's also the economic engine of the Asia-Pacific region, which is forecast to contribute 67% to the world's GDP expansion. Okay, very big, important point there. But the United States is far from immune. And basically, the effects of a slowing Chinese economy would inevitably impact the United States as well, and its geopolitical relationships. And like I mentioned earlier, is that the United States also still depends on China for some very key industries and very key materials. And that's the main point that I want people to understand is that we cannot decouple from China and we cannot end this relationship with China without completely unraveling our own US economy. Okay. You look at the equipment we're using today, right? We both of us have, these high-end microphones and cameras and software and all of these lights and things that we're using. All of these come from China. If they don't come from China directly, a lot of the parts are manufactured in China or the technology in them. And there's a reason for that is because for many years, China, we've built this up. One thing that I want people to understand is that China never asked American CEOs to come to China, come build your factories here. American CEOs went to China to take advantage of that cheap labor and to take advantage of that opportunity. And that's why Apple has become the world's most, valuable company in the world, simply because they manufacture their products in China. And then as not only do they export those products around the world, but as China's middle class is growing, they then re-import them back into China and sell them at a very high cost point as well. So it's been a very lucrative relationship for the United States. I mean, I saw, for example, there's a Popeye's Fried Chicken, very popular fried chicken restaurant chain. They're forecasted to open another 1,300 stores in China this year. Robust growth in China, happening right now because the Chinese people love American fried chicken. And so I think that's where, I want people to understand that this is an important relationship, not only for both countries, but for, every country in the world. And it is in our best interest to find a way to peacefully coexist. And so if you look at the headlines that are saying China's economy is struggling, yeah, it is struggling. And we've also seen a lot of America struggle as well. Don't forget, when the 2008 financial crisis happened, with Lehman Brothers and the subprime mortgage crisis that our companies caused, it was China that bailed out the United States. A lot of people don't realize that. It was China that bought our treasury bonds and really bailed the United States out. So, I mean, it really is, we live in a global economy. And I just want people to understand how important and interconnected we are.
Yep, our futures are definitely entangled, and hopefully it's a positive future. So, Cyrus, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. If
All
anyone
right.
wanted to find out more about your work, I know you have an amazing YouTube channel. Would that be the best place? Is there anywhere else?
Yeah, absolutely. Come join us on YouTube. And also, I've just launched a locals community as well. So if you go to cyrusjansen.locals.com, another great place for the community to connect. So look forward to it. So, Anthony, thank you so much for your time and pleasure to be on your podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much again.
All right. Take care.
Thank you so much for listening, and if you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe and click the bell icon so you are notified when new podcasts are released. I hope you're leaving with some great value about investing, trading, and finance. See you on the next show.